Hi there, and welcome to a special two-part bonus episode of Self-Inflicted Aural Nostalgia, a fans Guided by Voices podcast. My name is Jeff Gomez, and I'm the author of Zeppelin Over Dayton, Guided by Voices album by album, which is on sale now. In this episode, I'll be talking about four of the band's EPs from 1993 and 1994. I'll look at why they're special, what are the standout tracks, and why we've never really heard anything like them since. In the second episode, which I'll post in 2 weeks, I'll examine the band's influences, what Pollard's long called the 4 Ps, pop, psych, prog, and punk. So sit back and let's dive deep into the DNA of GBV. So when I was thinking of the podcast back in the fall of 2017, was trying to think of the scope and format of the show, I pretty quickly decided I wanted to cover only the band's studio records. The reason for this was simple. I wanted to find a way to organize, deal with, and just plain contain all of the band's output. Going chronologically through the official albums seemed the best way to do it, because if I included live records, compilations, EPs, and bootlegs, I just wasn't going to ever get through it all. At the time, GBV had 25 records, and that seemed like a good and iconic number. So even though this meant not talking about a few releases that I really liked, such as King Shit and the Golden Boys, I figured as a structure and a guiding principle, it made sense. Another reason I stuck to just the quote-unquote regular albums was because I wanted to, through them, tell the story of the band. And since a new record appeared pretty much every year, the LPs became an effective and handy way to mark time. Each album was like another layer of rock, pun intended, as we dug our way out from 1987 up to the surface of the present. I wanted all those albums to be kind of a musical biography. And yet, since pretty much the beginning of the podcast, if I've received one comment over and over, it's been a request to cover more than just the studio records. Because even though the studio albums make up a hefty body of work, currently clocking in at 29 LPs, that's really just a third of Pollard's output. And yet I've always resisted, and it's not because I don't like stuff outside the albums, but instead it's because those releases didn't fit in thematically with the initial idea of the podcast or later the book. But as I got to think about it, and I had some email exchanges with GBV fans, it occurred to me that there's in fact a really rich vein of work that I'd overlooked and missed out on. A period that was interesting in terms of the history of the group and which hasn't been talked about much, even though it remains a fan favorite. And so, as the first part of my GBV DNA special double episode, what I want to talk about today are the band's early EPs, those gloriously ragged slabs of vinyl the group released in 1993 and 1994. Specifically, I want to look at 4 EPs. Their second from 1993, Static Airplane Jive, and then the first 3 they released the following year, Get Out of My Stations, Fast Japanese Spin Cycle, and Clown Prince of the Menthol Trailer. I want to talk about these not just because they're really enjoyable, but because they capture the band at an incredibly crucial period in their existence. The 4 Ps, which I'll talk about in the next episode, that unique Pollard blend of influences that make up his music, was beginning to be unleashed upon the world. And these 4 EPs, along with B1000, were really the last time all Bob had to worry about were the 4 Ps. When he was in his basement rocking out and recording with the guys, all he had to concern himself with was his influences, and maybe a wife or a neighbor if they wanted him to be quiet. As Pollard says in Matthew Cutter's book, Closer You Are, when we got to the point that we were recording on 4-track and we knew people were interested, that's when we became good. Because I didn't think we were that good. Once we got signed and recording only on 4-track, that's when I found my voice. This surely became a double-edged sword, because after the release of Clown Prince of the Menthol Trailer, when B1000 came out and became a critical hit and indie rock success, GBV were, all of a sudden, a known entity. They had a following. Magazines everywhere were writing about them, and because of all that attention, the band would never be the same. As GBV began to become known outside of Dayton, getting signed to a New York label for 6 figures and touring the world, the voices that lobbied to guide Bob belonged to his label, fans, and critics. What's also interesting about these EPs is that the band would never again turn to the format in the way they did in the early 90s. Because if you add on the I Am a Scientist EP, that makes 4 in 1 year. And while GBV sort of released EPs as the years went on, they were never like what came out at the tail end of 93 and the start of 94. What followed those magical 2 years were really glorified singles or B-side compilations. They were just songs hanging around from LPs. The gonzo spirit of the basement was replaced by failed studio experiments. So let's take some time and talk about what I think is, beyond being just a really important period of the band, is also just a really fun one. These 4 EPs contain, I would argue, some of the group's most joyous, unself-conscious, and absolutely batshit moments. They're key to understanding the band's early days, and they're a goldmine for any casual fan wanting to dig in a little deeper. In a recent oral history on the website Uprocks, which looked at the 25th anniversary of Alien Lanes, Tobin Sprout talked about how the band was operating at the time. We were recording daily. We'd get together and do a session, and then pretty much everything was handed over to Bob, and Bob would divvy it up on the EPs, albums, and singles, or whatever was coming out. A lot of little labels were asking us to do singles, and there was just so much material at the time. Thanks to the exposure that had come with the scat releases, The Grand Hour and Vampire and Titus, and the positive reviews that followed, labels all over the world reached out to Pollard for product. And since Bob for years had felt stymied, logjammed, and just plain underappreciated, he said yes to everything. This resulted in an explosion of material. Toby manned the controls on the 4-track, the guys drank some Miller Lite, and, as Pollard says, we were just banging out songs in 5 or 10 minutes. So let's crack a beer, descend down the stairs of the Snake Pit, and delve a little deeper into some of the band's best work, starting with Static Airplane Jive. Now, this was actually GBV's second EP of 1993 and their third overall. Their very first release, 1986's Forever Since Breakfast, was a 12-inch, 7-song EP. After breaking up the band in the wake of 1992's Propeller, which itself followed a string of self-released LPs that went nowhere, Robert Griffin from Scat Records reached out to Bob and offered to put out a single. Pollard came back with The Grand Hour, a 6-song introduction to the band that's pretty much perfect. Pollard felt he'd mastered the format. The secret, as he put it, 5 throwaways and 1 hit. Static Airplane Jive holds 8 songs with a running time of just under 11 minutes. It was released on the Berlin-based label City Slang, which was founded in 1990 by Christoph Ellinghaus in order to release music by American bands. The label's dedication to the United States is evident even in its name. City Slang was the debut and only single by Detroit outfit Sonic's Rendezvous Band, a sort of proto-punk supergroup which featured members of MC5 and The Stooges. It's interesting to note that, even before the UK took notice of GBV, German labels like City Slang and Get Happy championed the group and put out their records. Get Happy released a compilation of tracks from the self-released albums, in addition to a new pressing of Devil Between My Toes. America may have been slow to acknowledge Bob's genius, but they were digging it overseas. The black and white cover of Static is pretty basic. There's not a Pollard collage per se, but instead there are some found photos. The front features what looks to be a British schoolteacher fiddling with a TV antenna, while the back sports a young female gymnast, arms splayed wide. The songs are written on the back in marker, and on the front, the EP's name is spelled out in transfer letters. If you were just seeing this in the racks of a record store and didn't know much about the band, the cover would be a pretty good indication of what you'd hear when you got it home. Static Airplane Jive, I should also mention, is a GBV song. It was recorded in the late 80s and was on the first Suitcase compilation, credited to the band Antler. The EP kicks off with Big School. This opening track is an absolute blast. It's pure, ragged joy caught on tape. Bob and the guys are singing and playing their hearts out, and for the first time, they know someone might actually hear, not to mention appreciate, their efforts. These are not the claustrophobic garage sessions at Steve Wilbur's, when the boys were pretty sure they were just spinning their wheels and half the band had their eyes on the door. This is the sound of a group triumphant, happy, and cohering for the first time. For a basement recording captured on a 4-track, it actually sounds amazing. Tobin Sprout's mastery of the device was crucial to the band's early success. Songs during the reunion era 20 years later on LPs like Let's Go Eat the Factory and English Little League didn't sound half as good. When Bob says late in the track, "Don't look back, don't ever look back because it just might catch you," his voice is panned to one side of the stereo spectrum, and it's a really effective touch. Since Pollard was still a 4th grade teacher in '93, and it was also beginning to be known in the world of indie rock, the lyrics are both biographical and metaphorical. It opens with Pollard in Johnny Paycheck mode, saying he feels like a slave and that his boss is a sinister bastard. But then he writes, "Worlds are colliding all around you," a reference to the duality Pollard was feeling at the time. Bob was torn between his daydreams and his day job. Just a few years prior, after breaking up the band around the time of Propeller, he was sure his hope of making it in music was over. But now here he is, grabbing his notebooks, again a dual reference. First to the notebooks that contained song lyrics, and second to the metaphor of Bob as a student in the music game, and he's headed off to big school, a world he's always wanted to join but would have proved over the years stubbornly elusive. The only thing I find disheartening is reconciling the boundless enthusiasm heard here with the world-weary resignation of later track Littlest League Possible, which finds Pollard resigned to his somewhat marginalized position in the musical world. Sometimes big schools, in fact, lead to little leagues. Second and last song on side A is Damn Good Mr. Jam.
Damn good Mr. Jam, hoping to be the pig I am, the pig I want.
At 3 minutes and 35 seconds, this is not only the longest song on this EP, but it's the longest track on all 4 of the EPs discussed here. It's also the total opposite of opener Big School, which had a, well, big sound. Here, there's really no drums and the tempo is slower. The guitars are rolling and arpeggiated, sounding like R.E.M. or the Smiths. Mr. Jam was originally slated to be part of 2 shit-canned LPs, 1991's Back to Saturn X, where it was planned to be the last song, and The Corpse-Like Sleep of Stupidity, which was slated for the following year. 2 snippets appeared in the Propeller track Back to Saturn X radio report, namely the Anything for Free line, which appears a bit more halfway through and then again at the end. A shorter and more slightly raw version appears in the first volume of Suitcase, credited to the band Ghost Fart.
Damn good Mr. Jam, hoping to be the pig I am, the pig I've always been.
Clocking it at a still lengthy 2 minutes 42 seconds, in this version there's a sinewy lead guitar, drums, and background vocals. It's a much more realized song, although it's missing the hint of melancholia that the Static Airplane Jive version is steeped with. Randy Campbell gets a co-write here. He's a friend of Bob's and can be seen on the back of the sleeve for Vampire and Titus, standing behind Pollard in the picture of Bob swigging a beer. He's got a few other GBV co-writes, such as Big Fan of the Pigpen from B1000. He still seems to be in Bob's orbit since he gets a credit for backup vocals on the Cash Rivers track The Monkey from the Blue Balls Lincoln LP. When Bob sings here, hoping to be the pig I am, the pig I want to be, the pig I've always been, it's a brutally honest self-assessment, Pollard acknowledging that, like all of us, he's a flawed individual. It's a super wistful and super effective song. First track on side B is Rubber Man. At 34 seconds, this is the shortest song on any of the 4 EPs. It's also a rare co-write with drummer Kevin Fennell. It's also another song that can be found on one of the Suitcase compilations, this time the most recent one, Suitcase 4, credited to Manly Weathers.
You bounce back, you roll back, you know, you knew me, you want me, you want me.
This version sounds very much like Bob's initial demo. Halfway through the track, Pollard pauses and adjusts the microphone. He's also kind of figuring out the lyrics as he goes, mumbling and humming where words will go later. It actually sounds really good and is a pretty amazing snapshot of his creative process. In fact, I find it fascinating to think that when he was done laying this down, he went upstairs and went back to being a father or a teacher. He would put down the guitar and pick up his child or grade some papers. And frankly, which journey meant more to him, going up the stairs from the snake pit or heading down? Maybe at this phase it was still a mix. We're all torn between different priorities and responsibilities, but at this stage, when Pollard was making these EPs, I think he was feeling the pull especially hard. The lyrics even hint at the struggle he may have been feeling. For example, did Bob see himself as the song's subject? Was he a rubber man who knows where he's going but who always bounces back? But this time, he and the guys had played in New York City and had had a taste of what the next couple of years were going to be like. That must have been confusing not just for Bob, but for his wife and kids. Who was he now? What was he going to become? He was literally Rubber Man, having to take different shapes or personas depending on the situation. Anyway, the band Rally for Japan covered the track for the Blatant Doom Trip tribute record from 1998. Second track on side B is Hey Aardvark.
Hey Aardvark, where's my ashtray? Put it in my room so I can smoke. Let's hire a race car driver, drive through the park and just tell jokes.
This brief tune, it's under a minute, is really fun. It sounds like it was tracked live with some of Bob's friends with him in the basement. This gives it a fly-on-the-wall feel, putting you right there in the snake pit alongside Toby and Mitch. Hey Aardvark has been played live over the years. It made appearances during the band's farewell tour in 2004, its comeback tour in 2010, and was part of the band's 100-song blowout on New Year's Eve 2019. It's also another slight reworking of older material, this time a rewrite of a longer song called Old Engine Driver, which was later credited to Audubon Damon and which surfaced on Suitcase 3. Here's what that sounds like. Back to the EPs. Now let's meet the Glow Boy Butlers. This is the heaviest song on the EP. GBV here sounding very much like a garage rock band. The bass, played by Mitch Mitchell, who would later move to guitar, is really prominent. This gives the track a nice and beefy sound. A lot of the early GBV stuff sounds really tinny and thin, in part to mimic the transistor radio sound of the 60s, but the fullness here is really welcome. Final song on Static Airplane Jive is Gelatin, Ice Cream, Plum. The EP goes out on a total high note with this high-spirited rocker that reminds me of the following year's Echoes Myron or Gold Star for Robot Boy. It's super fast with lots of fills and another great bass line from Mitch Mitchell. His melodic playing here really makes me wish he'd stayed with the band in '97 when Pollard tried to move him back to bass. But seeing it as a demotion, Mitch left the group instead, not returning for more than a decade. It's a shame since he shows a real sense of melody, something he didn't have a chance to exhibit later when all he was doing was pounding out power chords and chain smoking. Bob sings here, "It doesn't matter what's said and done as long as you've had your fun," adding later that you still got your gelatin, ice cream, plum. It's pretty much the perfect Pollard mix of bitter and surreal. Not to mention it's a continuation of the themes found on the second side of 1992's Propeller. The band's next EP, Get Out of My Stations, which came out in early 1994, was released on a label much closer to home. Silt Breeze was a Philadelphia-based label started by Tom Lax, who had grown up in southern Ohio. Similar to Sub Pop, it began as a zine in 1987 and only later started releasing records, the first of which was a 7-inch by Halo of Flies. But first, in order to get the cash to press the records, Lax cashed in an $800 life insurance policy his grandmother had taken out on him. By the early 90s, Silt Breeze were working with a number of important indie rock bands, including ones GBV would either later play shows with or get compared to in reviews, such as Sebadoh and Strapping Field Hands. Lax also worked with Ohio-based bands and Pollard peers, such as Mike Rep and the Quotas and Jim Shepard. Shepard, you'll remember, was the songwriter from Columbus who had given Bob the title for Vampire on Titus. As Brian Howard wrote in 2006 in the Philadelphia City Paper, Lax specialized in putting out music you either got or you didn't, music you absolutely adored or really fucking hated. In the early 90s, with their lo-fi sound, cryptic lyrics, and sometimes sloppy playing, GBV fit right into that category. Silt Breeze was a perfect home for them. In fact, it was almost Silt Breeze and not Scat who first brought the band to the world. Fan of the group Mike Rep, who had worked with GBV on Propeller, had been pestering Lax to release something by the group. Lax had the early self-released LPs, but they just didn't click for him. It was too much like R.E.M. Lax was into harder and weirder stuff. But then, when Lax was back in Columbus for Christmas, Rep played for him Propeller. Lax finally got it and asked how he could work with the band. Rep then informed him that Scat had beaten him to it. However, Lax would later console himself by releasing this EP. Personnel-wise, what's interesting about Get Out of My Stations is that the drummer is a guy named Larry Keller. Keller didn't have a long tenure in the band, appearing pretty much only on this EP, a few Suitcase tracks, and on the sole album by Hazard Hot Rods, the video store improv jam Big Trouble. The original 7-inch contained 7 songs and clocked in at 11 minutes and 6 seconds. The sides were labeled This and That, this being the A-side and that being the B-side. Get Out of My Stations was reissued on CD in 2003 with 4 bonus tracks, all of which were live recordings from clubs throughout Pennsylvania and spanning years 1992 to 1994. Featured are killer performances of Motor Away, Hot Freaks, Weed King, and Postal Blowfish. The cover is a gorgeous photograph taken by Tobin of Jim and Bob in the snake pit, a ray of light hitting Jim in the chest. The EP begins with Scalding Creek.
In the Scalding Creek, we were happy, just to be happy.
Whereas Static Airplane Jive roared out of the gate, Stations begins with a gorgeous and wistful tune which sees Pollard thinking back to a time when he was happy just to be happy. A period filled with swims in creeks and lakes, and when he and the guys were thinking about drinking, looking forward to that first beer that tasted so good at the end of a long summer's day. It's Tom Sawyer meets Samuel Adams. Adding to the sense of nostalgia and yearning already found in the song, a video for the track was included on the Some Drinking Implied DVD. The footage is mainly just close-ups of photos that seem to have been taken around the same time as the cover of the EP. The shots show the guys in Bob's basement, Pollard and Toby, staring into the camera lens as if these casual shots were the press photos they would soon be subjected to. The overall vibe here reminds me of the line in Joy Division's song Decades, "Here are the young men, a weight on their shoulders." Except GBV weren't really young anymore, they were all pushing 40. So what they were knocking on wasn't exactly the doors of hell's darker chambers, but was instead middle age. This was not philosophical or existential dread, it was just the calendar. Time was running out, and if their dreams were going to come true, it had better happen soon. Kelly Deal, backed by fellow Ohioans Buffalo Killers, turned in an absolutely stellar version of this track on the Sing For Your Meat tribute record that came out in 2011. Second song on the This Side is Mobile. This is pretty ragged and bare bones, with a couple of guitars and what sounds like a drum machine, but it's also a lot of fun. Bob's basically riffing on the Who's Going Mobile after a few too many beers. He also seems to be hinting at the just get out of there and go freedom he would espouse on next year's Motor Away, Pollard writing, "From street to street now, from town to town now, I kept on moving." This is the restless Bob, the one who declares, "Don't stop now and keep it in motion and run wild." The point of life is to never stand still, to always be moving. So now let's move on to Melted Pat.
Melted Pat knows where she's at. She's copying a buzz on something that was.
This is another track that was previously considered to be included on the LP's Back to Saturn X and The Corpse-Like Sleep of Stupidity. A live cover of this by Shub was included on the Blatant Doom Trip tribute record. After Pollard name-checks the Static Airplane Jive track Damn Good Mr. Jam on the first line, Melted Pat transforms into a 2-chord garage rock chug that's a lot of fun. And while the guitars are panned to separate stereo channels, giving the song a nice effect, I wish there was a bass line to give it some bottom end, otherwise it sounds really great. The lyrics are mostly silly, revolving around a slightly drunk girl with alopecia. But late in the song, there's a really nice line, Bob writing, "Melted Pat, she's telling me that I'm living a lie, I'm wearing a tie." The character is telling Bob he needs to be true to himself. His day job isn't his passion, he needs to follow his dream. Within the next year, Bob would indeed ditch the tie, quitting his job as a school teacher to become a full-time musician. The dream had become real. Final song on the first side is Queen of Second Guessing. While I love the first 3 tracks on the EP, this one's pretty dispensable, if not just annoying. In its nearly 1.5-minute running time, there's so much tremolo on Bob's voice I can't understand a word he's saying except the name of the song and maybe the word exploded. Some random drums appear, but there's no real tune. From past lo-fi experiments, we know it could be worse, but I can't say it adds much to the EP. Jason Hernandez, on his website The Constant Bleeder, writes of the track, "It's one of those fucking around on the basement songs, which are an essential part of what Guided by Voices is about." I agree. In fact, all of these EPs are pretty much Bob and the guys fucking around in the basement. Sometimes they hit gold and sometimes they don't. This track for me isn't quite gold. First song on that side is Dusty Bushworms.
The song will hold you in its arms. The song will fill you with its charm.
Same as Melted Pat, Bushworms was slated to be both on back to Saturn X and a corpse-like sleep of stupidity. It's also really touching, with Pollard promising, "This song will hold you in its arms. This song will fill you with its charms." It's an empathy-filled pep talk disguised as a slow dance, the same as REM's Everybody Hurts or Peter Gabriel's Don't Give Up. The last minute has some nice harmonizing from Pollard and some backward tape fragments, giving the track a Revolver vibe. An alternate version appeared on Suitcase 2, credited to the Plexigral Beehive.
The song will hold you in its arms. The song will fill you with its charm. A rapid...
Except for a weird clipping noise that's present throughout the track, which may just be warping due to the cassette master being stuck in the suitcase too long, this version is actually quite sublime. It features a full band sound and dreepy vocal by Pollard. There's even a guitar solo and some drum fills. Second song is Spring Tiger.
She calls for time, a beckoning upon each cozy.
The guitar here on another quiet song sounds very much like a combination of Drinker's Peace and Don't Stop Now. Not to mention, in the middle, it's a dead ringer for When September Ends by Green Day. It's also another track where an alternate version exists, with a different take on Suitcase 1 called Spring Tigers, and credited to the group Crushed Being Groovy.
In the morning, she calls for time, but not too late. The factory moment, but not to climb the 6 feet.
What's interesting is that, the same as Dusty Bushworms, the Suitcase version sports a full band and another guitar solo, whereas on the EP it's quite stripped down. The sound here harkens back to the band's early REM influence. Of the two, I much prefer the Suitcase version, although it would have stuck out like a sore thumb against the rest of the EP. In fact, what's amazing about a whole lot of the tracks that appear in these 4 EPs is that, even though they sound unrehearsed and spontaneous, as if Bob and the boys were indeed making it up as they went along, a lot of them are reworked versions of existing tunes. Now, that doesn't mean that anyone other than Pollard knew the chords or the changes, but it shows that, even at this early stage, Bob was curating and choosing how the band represented itself. Final song on the EP is Blue Moon Fruit. This is a super rough song that sounds very much just like a jam or a sketch, but rather than being annoying, the bare bones sound and improv feel makes it just as much a document of the band as the photo on the front of the EP. It's a nice end to a solid sonic artifact. Let's now move on to Fast Japanese Spin Cycle. Now, of the 4 EPs discussed in this episode, this one I think has the most interesting backstory. While the other labels in the wake of The Grandauer and Vampire on Titus reached out to Bob for an EP or a single, one label, Engine, wanted an entire record. Engine was an offshoot of the East Coast hardcore label Blackout Records, which was started by Jim Gibson and Bill Wilson in 1988. The label released EPs by bands such as Outburst, Uppercut, and Sheer Terror. Engine only released half a dozen or so records, with GBV's being the highest profile. What Bob initially put together for Engine was his usual recipe of new tracks, demos, and older tunes. The proposed title was All That Glue. This is where things get complicated. As Robert Griffin wrote in the liner notes to the director's cut edition of B1000, when Bob told me about the LP, I was pretty upset considering the circumstances. I didn't mind if the band released singles with other labels, but albums were another matter. Pollard saw things Griffin's way and trimmed down All That Glue to what we now know as Fast Japanese Spin Cycle. Seeing as how All That Glue was basically an early version of what would become B1000, it's fortuitous things turned out the way they did. Because what Pollard was proposing as the follow-up to Vampire on Titus was not nearly as strong as what eventually came out on Scat, and I'm sure the history of the band would be much different had Engine released a full-blown LP. Speaking of the title, English duo Sleaford Mods just this year released a compilation named All That Glue. As a consolation prize, Fast Japanese Spin Cycle is awfully good. It's a super solid listen and a longtime fan favorite. Former White House Press Secretary Jay Carney, a GBV superfan, when asked by Magnet magazine to pick his 3 favorite Robert Pollard records, included Fast Japanese Spin Cycle alongside B1000 and Alien Lanes. The cover to Fast Japanese, while not a Pollard collage, fits in perfectly with his and the band's found object aesthetic. It's also very funny. The core element is a photo of 3 teenagers who are at a carnival or county fair. The face of a clown, or what looks to be a circus big top, are in the background. This places it squarely in both the band's past and present. Clown and circus imagery was used on Same Place the Fly Got Smashed, and would show up in later lyrics such as on Circus Day Holdout on August by Cake more than 20 years later. The photo of the teenagers is very late 80s / early 90s. One kid's wearing an acid wash jacket which has a Bart Simpson t-shirt poking out from the inside. Another kid sports a mild mullet and is wearing a denim jacket with an Iron Maiden Son of a Seventh Son patch on the back. A third kid's wearing a painter's hat. Typewritten words from the name of the EP cover one kid's mouth and another's eyes. The band's name is in the upper right corner in a variety of transfer letters. It's a super fun cover and unlike much else in the band's catalog. The back also features a funny photo. It's of a chunky guy with a full-on mullet and bad mustache. He's holding a cucumber that's been turned into a shark. It's a really fun package and my personal favorite of the 4. In terms of who played on the record, it's the usual suspects of Bob, Jim, Toby, Mitch, and Kevin, plus Dan Toohey joins in on bass. Dan was a guy who was close to Toby, having been in pre- and post-GBV bands such as Fig 4 and Eyes and Weasel. He was in the group's orbit in the early 90s, which is why his name shows up here, as well as on scattered Vampire and Titus and Propeller tracks. The EP kicks off with Third World Birdwatching.
Hiding behind a mercury curtain, dark on the egg grimmer flies the coop in the age of transfusion.
The title here, a bit absurd, a bit poetic, is just about perfect Pollard. As songs go, it's one of the shorter ones at a mere 42 seconds. Of course, to fit more than one track into a side of a 7-inch, they had to be brief, but this one feels more like a snippet than an actual song, which just so happens to be short. The EP's title gets a mention in the lyrics, Pollard writing, he finds a tag reading Fast Japanese Spin Cycle, and that's the code for go. Another interesting thing is that Pete Jameson, an early booster of the band Pollard had sarcastically labeled GBV's manager for life, gets a co-writing credit along with Bob and Jim. Pete was thanked on a lot of records and has proved crucial to the history of the group, but it's not often that he's played a part in the writing of any GBV songs. He's only co-written 2, this and the meandering Sinister Infrared Halo, which appeared on Suitcase 2. Second song is My Impression Now. This early GBV classic hits that lo-fi 90s sweet spot perfectly. It sounds a little ragged, sure, but that's part of its charm. Pollard's got the English accent going, there's a super melodic bass line, and there are drum fills left and right. If Bob's employing his EP formula of 1 hit and 5 throwaways, this is definitely the hit. It's a really fun track. A slow acoustic version was included in a 1998 compilation sent out for the holidays by Bob's management company.
Told me you'd give your soul to the crowd and run to the edge of the war zone. You're finding out that it's way too late to get happy around your friends. You made your bed and laid your head through time, circumstances, and medicines. You lied a lot.
Doug Gillard contributed a similar sounding version to the tribute record Blatant Doom Trip, which came out that same year. What's interesting is that Doug's version, played on an acoustic and recorded on a 4-track, is credited to his band at the time, Gem. That group, which didn't last too long, also included future GBV member Tim Tobias. Doug actually contributes 2 tracks to the tribute, also covering Kisses to the Crying Cooks, which is the final track on Fast Japanese Spin Cycle. As if all of that Pollard-related activity didn't point the way toward a long-term collaboration with Bob, not to mention an affinity for his work, Doug's other band he was in at the time, Cobra Verde, led off the compilation with a sort of goth-sounding version of Alien Lane's track Striped White Jets. They would of course join up with Pollard for the Mag Earwig record. Third song is Volcano Divers.
Volcano divers. Volcano divers.
With an acoustic guitar set against a weird noise that threatens to overwhelm the tune at any minute, Volcano Divers reminds me a lot of the Grasshopper Eaters from Bob's solo record / return of GBV in 2016, Please Be Honest. Except for my money, the Please Be Honest song is marred and ruined by the extra element, whereas here it works. The line also about so much reported and so much distorted feels especially relevant in our current era of misinformation and purported fake news. An even more lo-fi version of Volcano Divers was contributed by the two-piece Dayton band Swearing at Motorists for the Blatant Doom Trip tribute record. The original drummer for the group was Don Thrasher, who had also played in GBV. Swearing at Motorists is still around today, having relocated to Germany in 2005 and releasing their latest record, the very fine While Laughing, The Joker Tells the Truth, in 2014 on Anton Newcomb's A Recordings label. A video was made for the album track Groundhog Day by Mike Postolakis, who I spoke to for this podcast and who has directed a number of videos for Pollard's various bands, most recently 5 Degrees on the Inside from August by Cake. So check out Swearing at Motorists if you haven't already. Final song on side A is Snowman.
Before I kill you, tell me something. Why'd you hide your plastic money?
This Kevin Fennell co-write is short at 47 seconds. It's also a lot of fun, Pollard marrying standard rock and roll lines like "We are likely to enjoy a night together" with his own surreal wordplay. And when Bob gets to the line, "Before I kill it, tell me something," there's some really effective harmonizing. It's a good song and a very nice way to end the side. Side B kicks off with Indian Fables.
Back up north with the wind. I'm traveling, and last I heard 12 sad stories from disciples of the sun.
This song is absolutely gorgeous, with a perfect Pollard melody sitting atop some strumming by Sprout. The fact that you hear some ambient basement chatter only adds to the track. It makes you feel like you're right there in the snake pit, swigging a beer as the boys unwind and play some tunes with their friends. The vibe goes a long way towards explaining the charm of these EPs and a lot of GBV's early material. Second song on the second side is Marchers in Orange. This is the first of 2 alternate versions of tunes which appeared on the band's first widely available record, 1993's Vampire and Titus. This seems a bit odd since Bob had hundreds of tracks floating around, not to mention he can knock out new ones in no time. However, since these alternate versions are markedly different from what's on the LP, they're actually pretty interesting. For example, on Fast Japanese Spin Cycle, Marchers in Orange is a full-blown rocker, whereas on Vampire and Titus it's smaller and much more intimate.
The white lines are tracers for the facers of the aftermath, positioned in the situation, lost in battles of love.
And while I love the EP version, I think the song's archaic lyrics are better suited to the Vampire and Titus instrumentation. Either way, they're both great versions, and it's fun to be able to compare them. Third song is Dusted. Same as in the prior track, what's on the EP is a lot different than was on the LP that came out the previous year. Here's the Vampire and Titus version. This version's obviously a bit heavier with drums and electric guitar. It has the chugging forward momentum of the following year's Motor Away. But the lyrics are pretty low in the mix here and it's hard to hear them. I'm glad Pollard redid the track and included it on Fast Japanese Spin Cycle. I actually prefer the EP version, mainly because you can hear the words, which are really amazing. The lyrics are basically one long verse. However, in just a few dozen lines, Bob comes up with just as many arresting images and phrases. The whole song seems to be a goodbye to his childhood and maybe his life. Pollard writing about the ignorance of youth and that he's pushing past established religion with its healing hands and thorny crowns. And even though he's trading his own path for this, the price is steep. He writes, "As the cattle rack was cleared, the floor was brightly stained." A cattle rack is how cows are moved from one place to another. They're often used to take them from the farm to the slaughterhouse, so basically, you may not get out alive. And yet, what he's trading for all this may not even be worth it, Pollard admitting, and larger though we grew in size, not a thing was gained. The fate was so ordained. So maybe Bob, after all of that, didn't even have a say in what was happening. It was just fate. It's a great song, and I love this version where you can really hear the words. Even more curious was that yet another version of Dusted, clocking in at 1 minute and 58 seconds, was slated to be part of B1000. Robert Griffin has called this the 5th draft of the LP, which sported the subtitle Hardcore UFOs, the strangest of the lot. In the liner note for the director's cut, Griffin wrote, "This sequence seemed to exclude many of the strongest tracks that had been previously considered. 7 of the tracks were rough demos or alternate versions of previously released songs." So then B1000 almost ended up as a sort of King Shit and the Golden Boys, a quasi-compilation rather than a completely new work. Last song in the EP is Kisses to the Crying Cooks. This is the 3rd song in a row of reworked material, although in this case it's essentially the opening to Propeller's Over the Neptune Mesh Gear Fox. This is a fun version with lyrics that lean towards fantasy rather than fun. Pollard speaking of whimsy kings, slaves, and a girl of God. There's no mention here of Propeller's Great Party or rock and roll. And since this track was another one that was on the 5th draft of B1000, not to mention had been previously slated to be included on The Corpse-Like Sleep of Stupidity, it's obvious Bob liked it and wanted to include it somewhere. Keep in mind it was initially part of an even longer song than Neptune Mesh Gear Fox, first making an appearance on the almost 12-minute Special Astrology for the Warlock tour, a mini song suite that also included Propeller's Circus World and embryonic versions of Tractor Rape Chain and Class Clown Spots a UFO. Crying Cooks has a long fade-out, which suits the end of the track and the EP really well. And now that we're at the end of Fast Japanese Spin Cycle, let me say it's pretty amazing that just a few years into GBV's existence in the scene, with the alternate versions, snippets from shit-canned records, and the name checks of future LPs, you can see the Pollard verse beginning to be formed. Over the next few years, Bob would go on to create a big tent. In 1993 and 94, the first few polls were going up. Now let's take a look at GBV's 3rd EP of 94 and the final one we'll talk about today. The 7-track Clown Prince of the Menthol trailer came out on Domino Records. Domino was a British label started by Lawrence Bell and Jackie Rice in 1993 as a way to release American indie rock. Its first record was the 6-song Soul and Fire EP by Subado, which they'd licensed from Sub Pop. Other indie rock groups they released around the time of GBV included Smog and Royal Trucks. Domino described the hallmarks of these early releases as being home recording, a free hand, and an outsider mentality. It was another home that fit GBV like a glove. 10 years later, the label scored a #1 album with Franz Ferdinand's You Could Have It So Much Better, and a #1 single with I Bet You Look Good on the Dance Floor by Arctic Monkeys, both of which came out in the fall of 2005. To this day, the label is thriving, remaining independent and overseeing offices in the UK, Brooklyn, Berlin, and Paris. At the time it was released, Melody Maker reviewed Clown Prince, writing that this appallingly recorded, ludicrously lo-fi, semi-atonal, and bordering dangerously on the bonkers thing is magic. The review ends by describing the EP as pure, unconscious, gentle genius. The front cover is striking with its huge block of red and lines of black. Pollard's sparse collage element is the most restrained of the EPs, and to my eye, it's the most graphically interesting of the 4 sleeves. The back cover, credited to the John Laird Neurotic Parcel, features an array of black and white drawings and photographs, ranging from a knight on a horse to a guy playing a trombone to, of course, a dude swigging a beer. It's one of the rare occasions Pollard willingly used a design by someone else. Laird was a Vietnam veteran who later worked at GM. He was also an artist and musician. A page on the old Robert Pollard website, alongside 14 vintage shots of the band, describes Laird as the Dayton photographer of GBV from 1995 to 1998. He died in 2017 at the age of 73. An interesting thing about Clown Prince is that it sports the most co-writes by Bob's brother Jim at 3. Static Airplane Jive and Get Out of My Stations each had 1, and Japanese had 2. This period was the height of his involvement with the band. He also appeared in most photographs of the group around this time. Once Pollard moved out of his basement and began working with people outside his immediate circle, Jim appeared on records less and less. Side A kicks off with Matter Eater Lad.
He constructed a factory just because he was hungry, just to see how it tasted. Bicycle wheel in a brat's brain. Yeah, he's mad, he's mad.
The EP gets off to a blistering start with this really rocking track that has sort of a Cutout Witch vibe with a start-stop opening that segues to a stomping chorus. Because it was often played live, it's become a fan favorite. In fact, of all the tunes from these 4 EPs, Matter Eater Lad has been played the most, with the band racking up 108 performances between 1993 to 2011. The second most played song from these 4 EPs is My Impression Now. The song's about a DC Comics character from the 60s whose real name was Tenzil Kem, but was given the nickname Matter Eater Lad since he had the ability to eat anything, referenced here by his chomping on furniture in parking lots. Pollard's had a lot of comic book references and imagery in his lyrics, whether it's name-checking Superman, the Suicide Squad, or Gotham City. An ultra-fuzzed-out cover version of the track by the band Chapter 18 appears on the Blatant Dream Trip tribute record from 1998. Second song on side A is Broadcaster House. I should mention that for some reason, broadcaster here is spelled C-A-S-T-O-R instead of with an E. I'm not sure if that's a typo or whether it holds any sort of special significance. When Broadcaster House was in the running to be the title for what ultimately became known as Isolation Drills, it had reverted to the correct spelling. This song, a co-write between Jim, Bob, and Toby, is short at not much more than a minute long. It's pretty shaggy and chaotic, even for GBV. The lyrics consist of 4 verses, one of which is repeated 3 times. Moving on, it's Hunter Complex. This is a fun and loose track which grooves for 30 seconds before the vocals come in. And even when Bob starts to sing, his voice is low in the mix. That's probably a good thing since what he's singing is, I got the fever for a plate full of beaver. It seems as if the seed of Cash Rivers was sown way back in 1994. Next up, it's Pink Gun.
40,000 horse playing big gun. It's done. Gun, gun. Singing rat boy this and rat boy that.
As if the sexual nature of the previous track wasn't enough, the subject here is Pollard's Pink Gun, placing the track alongside similarly phallic-centric tunes as Kiss's Love Gun and XTC's Pink Thing. Pink Gun was dusted off for the 2004 farewell tour and was played at the New Year's Eve show captured as the Electrifying Conclusion DVD. The ragged and clipped nature of Pink Gun, it fades out rather than ends, which makes me think it's actually longer than it is on the EP, not that I could stand to listen to it for much longer, along with a few other weak tracks, makes Clown Prince my least favorite of these 4 EPs. By the time it was being assembled, I think even Pollard was tiring of recording and putting together releases. Keep in mind he was also figuring out the track list for B1000 around this time. What would have seemed like an answered prayer 18 months ago, someone wanting to release Bob's music, was beginning to feel like a chore. Be careful what you wish for, you just might get it. Last song on side A is Scalping the Guru. This fun track finds Pollard in an almost lounge singer mode, telling someone to guru me, baby. The off-kilter pronunciation reminding me of T-Rex's single Metal Guru from 1972. About a minute in, though, the song just stops in what sounds like a bad tape edit rather than Bob and the guys ending the track. That's a shame since it's a fun tune and I would have loved to have heard more. The following year, Pollard intended Scalping the Guru to be the name of the band's follow-up to B1000. What he was shopping around to labels was a 25-track cassette that was basically Alien Lanes, except it contained a song called Lariat Man, which would later surface as a B-side, and it was missing a handful of other songs, among them Game of Pricks. The B-side kicks off with Grandfather Westinghouse.
Grandfather Westinghouse, always the hand in glove. Do you think you could rise above?
There are only 2 songs on this side, and both are decently long at over 2 minutes. The first, Grandfather Westinghouse, is a pretty fun track, though the drums are primitive and a bit off. I kind of wish the guys had taken another stab at it and really nailed it. At their worst, these basement songs sound like a teenage band letting off steam after school, and at their best, they sound like The Who rehearsing in Shepherd's Bush in 1963. This track is somewhere in the middle. Similar to Scalping the Guru from the A-side, the track just sort of stops instead of ends. But Pollard's voice soon appears for the final track, and the edit there works. The Westinghouse that Bob mentions was a huge corporation that began late in the 19th century. It produced machinery like turbines and generators for electric companies throughout the U.S., including having a factory in Ohio. In the mid-90s, it was bought by the CBS television network, at which point it changed its name to the CBS Corporation. After a merger with Viacom later in the decade, the Westinghouse name was spun off into a nuclear energy division, which today does business as the Westinghouse Electric Company. Final track on the EP is Johnny Appleseed. This sublime and hypnotic track is the perfect closer. It doesn't sound like anything else in the GBV catalog. It features strummed acoustic guitar, surreal and rhyming lyrics by Bob, and background vocals from Tobin Sprout. And even if those basic ingredients can be found on half a dozen GBV LPs, they never sounded like this. I absolutely love that we finally hear Toby. He was crucial in the making of these 4 EPs. Without his mastery of the 4-track, most of the band's early work would be dismissed as the basement fucking around it actually was. Yet this is the first time we're getting his actual voice on any of these 7 inches. In fact, over the course of the 28 songs on these 4 EPs, none of them is a Tobin Sprout track or features him singing, which I think is a shame. If a few of Sprout's tunes were to have been sprinkled in between Bob's, these EPs would be even stronger than they already are. The lyrics here are a lot of fun, Pollard writing, "You're a breath of insulation in my draftic attic brain. You're sweeter than the sweet cream ladies buzzed on sugar cane." Compared to this, the simple chorus of Bob and Toby repeating the phrase, "You're so cherry," sounds almost like a mantra. Late in the track, Pollard writes, "I'm first lieutenant to you, I am Johnny Appleseed." Johnny Appleseed was in fact a real person. Born John Chapman in 1774, he roamed around a number of states in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, creating nurseries and planting apple trees throughout Indiana, Illinois, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. In fact, Ohio is currently home to not 1 but 2 museums honoring Chapman's work. Jason Hernandez, writing on his website The Constant Bleeder, writes of GBV's Johnny Appleseed, "The band play their parts as if they're trying to not wake up a cat sleeping in the corner of the basement. And it's a great song because part of the genius of Guided by Voices is that they make train wrecks like that sound good. In fact, I can't imagine a more polished take on it being better." He's totally right. The song is an imperfectly warm and utterly graceful goodbye to the final phase of the group. In just a few months, B1000 would be released and hailed as a masterpiece. Things were now expected. Pressure was building up. People were counting on Pollard to deliver another classic. Any return to the basement would now be an escape of a different kind.
I'm first lieutenant to you, I am Johnny Appleseed. You're so cherry, so cherry.
Okay, that's it for the show. In 2 weeks, I'll post part 2 of GBV DNA, this time looking at the 4 Ps, Pollard's musical influences. Go to everygbvlp.com to listen to past episodes of this podcast. Go to rockathonrecords.com to buy Guided by Voices albums on vinyl or CD. And be sure to pick up Zeppelin Over Dayton, Guided by Voices, album by album, wherever books are sold. Thanks for listening.